Welcome to another episode of the Property Nomads Podcast. I'm delighted to be joined by Stewart Little today of IRT Surveys. We are going to be discussing thermal imaging, working with social housing associations, talking about retrofit assessments, projects that have been done, and all of this in order to drive net zero carbon emissions basically in housing within the next 25, 30 years and beyond. It's quite an important topic. I'm going to be sitting back and playing dumb throughout this because I know a little bit, but not as much as Stewart does. You're going to stay tuned for this because there is a plethora of fantastic content that Stewart's going to be going through as well. So Stewart, that being said, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much, Robert. Thanks for the invitation. I look forward to the next 20, 30 minutes.
Yeah, it's going to be packed with some cracking information. I'm talking about thermal imaging, recognizing building defects, and all of this, I guess, is to push towards this net zero carbon emissions target that the government has set us. But before we dive into that, could you just give people a little bit about your background and how you've come into this line of work?
Yeah, of course. I'm for my sins, I left school when I was about 17 and started in an architectural practice. So I had 5 years of my career designing houses and commercial buildings. Then I was made redundant, which I thought was the end of the world. At 21, it felt horrendous. I got a job selling flat roofs and roof gardens. That's what kind of sparked my interest in the environmental stuff back in my early 20s. Did that for 5 years and then realized that when I was selling flat roofs, what I was doing was cutting core samples in them with a hammer, a knife, a bolster, and basically taking out a plug of insulation, taking a visual photograph of it, and then getting my blowtorch out and fixing the hole that I'd created. So I was invalidating the guarantee in the roof, I was risking burning the building down, and I was a sales guy with a blowtorch, which is quite a dangerous combination. So I realized through a bit of research and homework that you could actually take a picture of a flat roof and you could see the wet insulation from a thermal image. So nice and impartial, pictorial, easy to evidence, irrefutable, because a lot of these things end up in insurance claims and in courts of law as to who's to blame for that leaky supermarket or whatever. So I decided I was going to hand in my notice, hand back the BMW and the pension and the BUPA and everything else, and set up on my own. I very fortunately know a guy who was quite a successful computer programmer, a guy called Dave Jones. If you Wikipedia Dave Jones, he's the guy behind Grand Theft Auto, Lemmings, David Beckham Soccer, Crackdown. He's won a couple of BAFTAs, and he just happens to be one of my best friends. So I sat down with Dave Jones and said, look, I want to quit my job. I want to set up my own company. My brother's going to join the business. He's got an R&D background in chemistry. But these thermal imaging cameras are £40,000. I'm a regular guy. I don't have £40,000 in the bank to blow on a speculative camera. How do you do that? How do you raise money to set up a company and buy £40,000 of equipment and buy a car and go? And Dave said, look, I'll give you that. So my start in business was with a world famous computer programmer as my partner, fully funded, VAT registered, limited liability, with a lawyer, with an accountant, everything from day one. So that was the catalyst, but it's so far away from where we are today because we started as a flat roofing specialist, just telling people what was wrong with their roofs and trying to optimize the refurbishment. And where we ended up today, 19 years later, is we're doing net zero strategic planning and developing software to help save the planet, chalk and cheese. I've earned a few grey hairs along the way, Rob. You see them all.
Yeah, for the benefits of this being recorded, of course, video purposes. Yeah, I'm starting to get grey hair at 33, and I've started to get the odd one here. And it's concerning. I've been trying to avoid this day for a long time. But anyway, we're not here to talk about grey hair. We're here to talk about thermal imaging and zero carbon emissions. So that's how you started. Fantastic. It's always nice to be able to have connections with people that are then able to fund, especially a £40,000 camera to get started. Fair play. So fast forward to today then, with a lot more climate change awareness, net zero carbon emissions and so forth. This is all being driven, I say by the government. I mean, mainly it is, but various governments around the world. So you're saying to me that part of your job, part of your role is identifying buildings, properties, whether it's commercial, residential, etc., and identifying ways to improve them thermally, but also so it's eco-friendly and good for the environment at the same time. Is that a fair representation?
Yeah, it's we're trying to optimize the journey. So that we've got two things we do. The thermal imaging is a big part of our business, and we've been flying drones up the side of high-rise buildings, flying drones down the streets of Glasgow last year. Grenfell obviously had a bit of a catalyst to inspect cladding from that perspective. But what we've developed software-wise is like a sat-nav to net zero. So I view it as we're trying to embark on this journey. We've got to save the planet, Robert. There's one habitable planet that we're aware of, and this is it. So we have to, from putting my tree hugger, eco warrior voice on or hat on or whatever, we've got to save the planet. But on the flip side, there are an awful lot of vulnerable people out there who just want to save £50 a month on their utility bill because they're literally choosing between heating and eating. And we've got lots of customers in that end of the spectrum who are, if we can save them £50 a month, they want to give us a hug. And equally, we've got property investors who are saying, look, I need to mitigate risk. I need to make sure my properties are compliant. I don't want disrepair claims. I want happy tenants that pay the rent. And that's their fundamental driver. So we're kind of straddling that tightrope, I guess, between saving the planet, saving people £50 a month, but also mitigating risk for the actual money men who own the assets. So lots of our clients will say things like, look, I want to get to net zero by 2050, but I don't want to waste money. I don't want to make decisions with regret. And I want to optimize any funding that's available. I want my hands on any grants that are going. And that's what we do for lots of local authorities and housing associations. We've got probably about 500,000 houses hosted on our DREAM software. And what that does is basically take limited data, aggregate and augment that data with other data sets, and then run an impartial energy roadmap per house. So you can click your house on a map, you see it, and it says to you, look, this is what you need to do. And yes, there's grant funding available. And maybe there's a shortfall between, maybe it's a £10,000 thing, but there's only £5,000 worth of grant funding. It can also connect you to loans and debt at low interest rates that will help you get out of fuel poverty and do those retrofits. So one of the key things it does, and it's really important, is that it is impartial, because everyone I've met says their thing saves you 20% of your energy bill, be it loft insulation, wall insulation, a boiler, underfloor. So in theory, if you buy 5 things, you won't have an energy bill, if all of those people are telling you the truth. And yeah. I've not come across that yet, Robert. And that's what we do. We basically,
that's understood. Fair enough, and fair play. I think that's a great way of operating. The impartiality there is very important. People that might be familiar with UK accents will probably have worked out already that you're based in Scotland. Do you do all of this in Scotland, or is this something that you have branched into England for as well?
Most of our customers are actually in England. I know I'm talking to you from Dundee at the moment. So yes, we're a family-run business and we're up in Dundee, but most of our business is actually in the southeast of the country. The thermal imaging we've been doing for 19 years. The software we've been doing since about 2006, and the net zero stuff. specifically probably since about 2012, something like that. But it's constantly getting more and more refined, Robert.
That's fair enough. I think I should probably rephrase my own question. So are most of the properties that you've done, say you've got about 500,000, are most of the properties based in Scotland, or are they based in England?
Oh, so yeah, they're all in England. The majority, I think probably about 100,000 of the 500,000, probably about 400,000 are in England.
Perfect. And it might sound like I'm trying to be, I don't want to sound like I'm being too precise, but the reason that I'm trying to find out what numbers you've got where, as you know already, and I'm sure property investors listening to this will know, is that sometimes the regulations can be different in Scotland than they are to England, certainly for landlords over certain things. So it's interesting to get the numbers there. And when you're speaking to customers, and again, I'm not really able to come from a homeowner's point of view. I'll come at this from a landlord's point of view. Every landlady is different. You're going to have some that are more, socio-aware, that are more eco-aware. When it comes down to costing, whether there's funding or not, do you find it's quite difficult to get people over? Well, I say get people over the line. Do you find it's difficult for people to have an uptake on it if they're not too eco-aware? The reason for that, because I guess that most of the world, most of the country, just looking at cost, as in the financial cost, not necessarily an economic cost. We just look at the financial cost. So if you say to me or someone, Rob, yeah, you've got a property here in wherever, yeah, you can do solid wall insulation. There's some grant funding available. It's going to cost 20,000, but there's a £10,000 grant. You've got to find 10,000. Most people that I know, most landlords that I know, would either scoff at paying 10,000 or just wait for it till it's completely free. I guess that's a very long-winded way for me to say, do you find it difficult to get people over the line in taking up all the funding, or people just jumping at the opportunity because it's funded in the first place?
It's a really good question, Robert. And it does break into the three different sectors quite well. So the private rented is the hardest one, definitely. The social housing is relatively simple because most things are 100% free in that sector, and they're all driven, in that social ethos. They have to provide decent quality homes for vulnerable people and people on benefits and things. So everything, the funding to date has been largely geared toward that sector. But where the funding is moving is it's moving away from social housing into private landlords and owner-occupiers. So it's never been more important for a landlord to actually understand their assets better. The challenge we have in the private rented sector is if a landlord spends £100,000 upgrading 10 houses, all of the savings go to the tenant. So why bother doing it? That's the question we always get. Why would I spend 100,000? I'm not allowed to put the rent up. There's no benefit for me, and I don't save any money from the tenant or the house or whatever, the energy bill. So the conversation with private rented landlords is always around, look, the law is changing all the time, and there will come a point when it will be illegal for you to rent that house or sell that house unless it meets a certain code. So why not leverage as much grant funding as you possibly can whilst all the incentives are there? Why not do that now? And even if you don't do it, at least find out what you need to do and find out what the shortfall is, and find out when those hurdles are going to become immovable barriers. Because you might have a £3 million portfolio today, but just on the horizon, if you actually get the telescope out and peer at the horizon, there's a great big storm coming your way, and you need to be aware of it, and you need to start planning to navigate around it, rather than bump straight into it. I'm mixing all my analogies now. There's storms and barriers and hurdles. Sorry.
Owner-occupiers. It's okay. Analogy city today.
Owner-occupiers are easier, Robert. I ran my house through our software, and it said, look, you need solar panels and a battery. And this is just going back to your earlier point, the difference between Scotland and England can be quite frustrating because we need to run two sets of software for the Scottish rules and the English rules, which is twice the development time. But on my house and in Scotland, every single person in Scotland qualifies for an interest-free loan to do anything that improves their house in terms of energy efficiency. So I ran my numbers on my house on the software, and it said, if you get solar panels and a battery, you will save about £65 a month. And I got quotations to do solar panels and batteries, and it was £8,000. £8,000 over a 10-year loan works out about £65 a month. So rather than paying my utility bill, I'm paying for solar panels and batteries. So I'm not saving anything until I hit 59 years old. I'm 49 today, right? So when I'm 59, I'll have no debt from the loan and hopefully no electricity bill, provided I make and consume every kilowatt. And I don't, get 200-inch TVs and start burning twice as much energy. That's...
Interesting. The thing that gets me there, and I'd say it's probably just important to repeat what you've just said. You just say that every single homeowner in Scotland is entitled to a 0% loan in order to make improvements to their house. Can you just repeat that? Because I think that might be a big eye opener for many people that are listening in Scotland.
That's exactly it. If you go to Home Energy Scotland, you can access that website and everyone qualifies for it. And I have to tell you, I've had many loans in my time, Robert, business loans, small firms loan guarantees. I've bought motorbikes on loans. I've never filled in a more difficult, complicated loan process in my life. It took a fair amount of time to get it, but it's free. You can also get I think it's up to £20,000 interest-free loan to buy a second-hand electric vehicle, and up to £30,000 interest-free to buy a new electric vehicle from the Scottish Government, all unsecured.
We'll put links to that in the show notes. That's eye-opening.
Yeah, well, that's where Scotland is different from England, because in England it is different. But in on the flip side, we're doing a social housing development project in Aberdeen at the moment, which is 22,000 houses. It's a £5.5 million project. And the way the grant funding works in Scotland, we have to do all of the work first and then get paid. But we're involved in grant projects in England, and in England you get paid first and then you do the work. So the grant funding is much more appealing in England than it is in Scotland. And that's quite important because the grant funding pot is something like 9 billion over the next 10 years. It's a lot of money.
Yeah, it goes back to what they're trying to highlight at the start about the differences between Scotland and England. Little things like that, that process there is completely reversed, depending on what way, of course, you want to look at it from whichever country's point of view. Do you find that people don't know about these things in the first place, or that even if they do, the take up might not be that big? I mean, you've just admitted that document that you filled out to get the loan was painstaking. I think that was also an issue with the Green Homes Grant. A lot of feedback from people was the same, was it's a nightmare of paperwork. Yes, we're going to get X amount grant, which is great to do this and that, but some people just found the process too time consuming. I guess the easiest thing to say was probably a good government idea for once, bad execution. Not surprising because it's government, whoever's in charge. But do you find that when you're speaking to people, speaking to clients, speaking to landlords, that people just don't know about this funding, that it's available, or that they find the process of obtaining it too difficult? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I'm in the sector, Robert, and I hadn't heard about that grant. That grant that I have, the loan that I've applied for and that's paid for my solar panels, I wasn't aware of it until an offhand conversation with a utility company said, yeah, it's been around for 4 or 5 months and it closes in 6 or 7 months. that was news to me. But in filling it out, you had to tell them things like the MCS accreditation for the kit you're installing and for the installer. And then you have to sit and Google, well, what's MCS accreditation? What is that? And I don't know which brand of solar panel I'm getting. So it needs to be made simple. It needs to be so simple that you can walk into Tesco or B&Q and buy it. And once it's at that level, it will be much more attainable for everyone. If they fill in the paperwork for you, I'm sure it would go a lot faster. But even being I hate the word, but an expert in the sector, even with all that experience behind me, it was hard filling in the paperwork. Not rocket science hard, but harder than it ought to be.
Yeah, it's almost not surprising to hear, to be perfectly honest with you there, Stewart. It's, as you say, one way that this can be made easier is if the process is made easier, the information is made easier. Then that way people get access to, what they need and what they want. In terms of, you mentioned the, I say dream technology, DREAM, as you put it. So tell us a bit more about that, and then how people can benefit from using the software and the technology that IRT can provide.
Sure. Well, without this sounding like a sales plug, because I don't want to force things down your listeners' throats, DREAM is aimed at local authorities and housing associations, and it is an online software as a service portal where we basically hoover up data and spit out plans that say, if you do that, you'll save this much. There's the money, the carbon, and the kilowatts you'll save. So clients can say, look, they can load 50,000 houses on the platform very quickly, draw a polygon around an area, and as soon as the polygon closes, it says, look, there are 572 houses in that polygon, 320 of them need loft insulation, and 156 of them qualify for grant funding. That sort of thing is largely automated. We've, under the lockdown last year, we actually turned DREAM into an app for owner-occupiers called Hero. Hero's the Housing Energy Efficiency Retrofit Optimizer. I like a cheesy name, Robert. You maybe have sussed that out by now. DREAM's come true, the Hero within, all that kind of thing. But Hero, we've yet to launch it. But what Hero does is, if you're sitting in your living room, you press Find My House. It locates your house from the location of your mobile phone. It pulls in your energy performance certificate, if it exists. It pulls in a photograph of your house from Google Streets, so you can verify that that is your actual house. It asks you a handful of questions. How many bedrooms do you have? How many people live in the house? And then it can literally say to you, look, you qualify for £7,256 worth of grant funding based on what you've told us, and you could spend it on this, this, and this. It then connects you to Trustmark, because Trustmark have I don't know if your listeners are aware of Trustmark. Trustmark's basically a government set up body of accredited certified contractors who are able to install measures to a standard called PAS 2035. If it's not PAS 2035, it's not grant fundable anymore. So the Trustmark database is really essential going forward. And on our Hero app, you can book an appointment with a local contractor, because that's quite important as well. If we're trying to save the planet, there's no point in a contractor driving from Aberdeen to central London. If there's a guy in Guildford that can do a job in Epsom, then let's use him. Don't drive from Scotland. And forgive me if my knowledge of Guildford and Epsom, if that's a horrific journey. They were the first two.
No, it's relatively close. No, kudos on your geography there. They're relatively close in terms of travel time, and A3, M25. Anyway, yeah, past 2035, retrofit technology. These are things that we've touched on briefly on episodes before, mainly with Stewart Fairley of Elmhurst Energy themselves, talking about these government incentives, these government schemes. Very good, and this is a way that we're going now in order to get things retrospectively fitted. I'm qualified retro fit assessor as well. So, I've gone through that just to push my own curiosity and try and help people where I can as well. Same with doing the EPCs. I'm qualified to do residential EPCs. I find that it's a useful thing to do, but I'm a bit nosy, to be fair. Having a nose around other people's homes is always interesting. Yeah, obviously there to do a job, but I don't know if I should admit that on a podcast, but I just did anyway, so it is what it is. But this Hero software or app, and this Dream software sounds fascinating because it's linking everything in that needs to be linked in, but it also sounds like you're trying to streamline the process and make it as simple as possible for as many people as possible. And I think there's a very good market for that, because people want, as you've highlighted, people want things to be as simple as possible. That's nature of human beings. Yeah,
and people expect things on the internet to be free as well, Robert. So the Hero app is completely free. We haven't launched it yet. We're just waiting to white label it as someone else's, and us be the data monkeys behind the scenes, basically. That's why it's called Hero, so that the hero can be embedded within something else. Like instead of Intel inside, it's Hero within. That was my cheesy idea. But a lot of people, to go back to your landlord question, and owner-occupiers, a lot of owner-occupiers will only do an energy-efficient measure when they're putting a kitchen or bathroom in, which is usually significant enough that you'll be going back to your mortgage lender to say, look, I need to borrow 50, 60, 100,000 pounds. That's a really good point to say, let's put attic insulation, let's put an air source heat pump, let's insulate the house properly. That's I think a key trigger for most people.
Talking of measures, probably important to go through different types of measures that exist. So, I mean, if it's okay with you, I'll give a list of what I know is available, and then feel free to expand on them or of course, add others. So, things that would be available, from my understanding, and again, I'm just going to say in England because that's what I know the most. You could be looking at floor insulation, whether that's suspended timber or solid floor, cavity wall insulation, solid wall insulation, or external wall insulation, as you might know it, loft insulation, and as you just highlighted, air source heat pumps as well, especially given recent changes to legislation about new builds not having or not being allowed gas boilers from 2023, I believe, and then also even more recently about EPCs having a C rating by 2028, I think, in order for them to be rented successfully. They're the things that I can think of that funding might be available for. Have I missed out anything there, Stuart?
No, nothing fundamental. I mean, it's basically anything to do with the fabric can be improved. So your roof, your walls, your windows, doors, draft proofing, then all the fixtures and fittings in the house, things like you get an aerated washing machine, get aerated double glazing, all those kind of things. But you even get things like dynamic smart air bricks now that can open and close to let ventilation below your floor when it's needed. So it's not just an open vent all the time, blowing cold air underneath your house that you're subsequently heating. But the important bit, Robert, I think in really simplistic terms. I see a house as like a bucket with holes in it, and the energy is the water you're pouring in. So you can buy nice, fresh, super duper renewable energy and pour it in, which is great. But if the bucket's full of holes, there's no point. You have to do a fabric first retrofit. And if you do the underfloor, but don't do the walls, that's exactly the same effect as sticking your finger in one of the holes in the bucket. And what that does is just increase the pressure in the other holes. You still lose water at exactly the same rate. You've just plugged one hole. So you need to get all 10 fingers and plug all the holes and then fill it with nice, efficient water. So we've got access to something like £2 billion to fully fund batteries and PV on houses. But the people behind the money, it's a pension fund money, they want a nice long 25-year return on their investment. So although you and me could benefit from it in the future, right now it's only open to landlords that have got like 100 houses. And they say, yeah, come and fit 100 houses with PV and batteries. And everything from start to finish is free, but you have to buy all your energy from them. There's a behind the meter power purchase agreement. But one of the problems with the sector is you very quickly get into acronyms. When you mentioned solid wall insulation, my head instantly went, does he mean IWI or EWI? And CWI, so internal wall insulation, cavity wall, external.
Yep.
And that, if you're just a general member of the public, it's a minefield. It's so complicated. And then the government, whichever government it is, change the rules all the time. I mean, just the other day, Boris Johnson pushed something back from Easter to autumn. And everyone in my world is just, again, yet another delay. We just want a set of rules that's continuous for 5 or 10 years. Just put the goalposts down and don't move them, so we can build businesses based on solid foundations. And that doesn't happen. I've been in this
100%.
Very frustrating. But in my own defense, it lends itself really well to software, Robert. It's so fluid and so complicated that you need a computer to do the calculations for you.
100%. It's just going back to briefly talk about government there. I think it's a different podcast itself, talking about the various political systems that we do and don't have. I think when you're trying to fight for re-election every 4 or 5 years, you sort of do the vote winning stuff. I know they were saying that I was laughing with my friend, if England would have won the Euros, for example, the easiest thing Boris Johnson could have done was just give everyone a bank holiday on the 12th of July. Great vote winner, because everyone's going to be celebrating and, off their heads anyway. Football aside, I think that's the challenge when people are in every 4 or 5 years, is there's not always a very long-term way of thinking, because what one party might do might be completely different to what another party might do and how they might implement it. And of course, as you've highlighted, the knock-on effect is you get people in the industry like yourself sit back and go, oh, not again. So I get that. In terms of acronyms, yes, I realised when I was saying about it, yes, you've got internal wall insulation, cavity wall, external was EWI, CWIs. We love a good acronym. It's part of the fun. But I also imagine that, again, going back to trying to simplify things as much as possible, and this is going to lead us on to talking about surveys themselves. Got to make things as easy and as accessible as possible to people. So that's important point number one. Important point number two, when it comes down to doing an assessment on a building, as you've highlighted with when you started out doing flat roofs, some salesman comes around my house with a blowtorch, I'd be a bit concerned, I won't lie. But any surveys that can be done, like, I don't know, be drilling a hole in the wall to check for cavity, I mean, that can be quite intrusive to the fabric of the building itself. So how have you got around that so you can keep the integrity of the building intact whilst at the same time assessing it properly for potential measures?
Yeah, that's kind of the whole point of thermal imaging, Robert. The beauties of thermal imaging mean you can just take a picture of a building and you don't need boroscopes, drills, and just to mention the cavity thing, even if you take boroscopes, drill a hole, put a camera in the hole you drilled and have a look for insulation. Because of health and safety regulations, it's a one-man job, or one-person job, sorry, if you do it at waist height. And if you do it high up, it's a two-person job because someone has to hold the ladder. So most boroscope surveys are done at waist height because it's cost effective. But the way gravity works, it tends to pull things down. Gravity sucks and all that. So most of the missing insulation isn't on the ground floor, it's on the upper floor. And a thermal image, you can stand back from the foot of the garden, take one picture and say, I can see your insulation. Your insulation's in green, the missing stuff's in red. But what we actually, that £40,000 camera we bought back in late 2001, we started taking lots of photographs with it, as you might imagine. But we did 5,000 houses for Aberdeen City Council, and it was one of our very early jobs, Robert. We sat down with the council and said, what do you think? Look at all these great pictures, aren't they amazing? Red's bad and blue's good. What do you think? And they said, yeah, they're really good, but they're just pretty pictures, really, aren't they? And then I felt a bit crestfallen, but I went, what it did to me was make me go, they've got a good point. If I'm an architectural guy, my brother's a scientist, and my business partner's a world-famous computer programmer, surely we can quantify those pixels and turn the pixels into pounds. And then we raised some venture capital, and we wrote algorithms that could basically interpret the thermal image, take on board all the SAP criteria, and turn those pixels into pounds. So we went back to Aberdeen and said, look, we can now do this. Can we do more for you? And they said, okay, go and do the rest of the portfolio, which was another 30,000 houses. We did those 30,000 and presented them back with money attached to the bottom. So it literally added value to the images. And we said to them, okay, now what do you think? Now we've spent £500,000 inventing this software. What do you think? There's the money, the carbon, and the kilowatts associated with that house. And their feedback was, that's much, much better. But what you've done is very accurately describe, I definitely have a headache. What's the aspirin? Okay, and that level of customer insight is invaluable for a company like us, because you need your customer to say close, but no cigar. So that feedback led us to go back and say, okay, their problem, and it's the same for everyone, for you and me and for everyone in between, in terms of the social housing sector and private landlords, it's all well and good describing you definitely have a headache, but the aspirin could be a dozen different things. It could be ibuprofen, it could be paracetamol. What is it? And that's what our DREAM and Hero software do. They look at all of the variables and say, well, the data, the mathematics says you can save that by light bulbs, draft proofing, and sealing around your windows. And what the thermal imaging does to that is just bookend the data. So if the data says, hey, do this, the thermal image says, you definitely need it, the data's right, and the other thermal image says, and it's been done properly. So we like to do before and after where possible, and that keeps the supply chain honest.
Yeah, I mean, that also makes a lot of sense. That screams to me common sense, which, well, yeah, makes sense. In just thinking out loud, I'm just trying to think from, let's go back to a landlord, landlady point of view, whatever the correct PC word for people like that is nowadays, I don't know. Just so I've got a property portfolio. I've got a portfolio in the north of England. I'm acutely aware that there might be some grant funding available. I come across IRT surveys, come across yourself. So can you talk me through the process that I would need to go through as a landlord, and any costs associated with that? I'm just trying to get into the head of a landlord here.
Yeah, well, at the moment, what we would do is either do them individually on the Hero app. So landlord would download the app, type in 10 addresses, however many houses they owned, and do them one at a time, or put all 10 of them on DREAM in one go, and we would analyze all of them at the same time and spit out an answer. The tricky bit for IRT is DREAM's aimed at huge landlords, like with 5,000 or more, and Hero's aimed at people with one. So maybe I need to invent Hero Plus for people with 10 houses, so you can add a house, add a house, add a house. But the point of both of them is we want to find out where you are, find out where you want to go, optimize the journey, keep everything impartial, and give you the truth, and then connect to people who can actually do it from the money side of it and from the contracting side. Hence the PAS 2035 Trustmark links. Hence our involvement with guys like the Green Finance Institute. We're involved with their coalition of energy efficient buildings. I'm on a steering group that are writing a green rental agreement where the landlord and the tenant sign up to a green agreement where they're both incentivized to use energy optimally and efficiently, but they both share the risk and reward. And that's actually quite a tricky document to satisfy the lawyers.
I can well imagine. You got me speechless on that. Yeah, I can imagine that's not the easiest thing to be involved with at all.
It's every time someone on the committee says, hey, I think we should do this, a lawyer says, yeah, but that's illegal. And then someone else says, yeah, but what about this? And it all makes perfect sense. But through some GDPR, it's illegal, or through some landlord not being allowed to increase the rent, it's illegal. It's fraught with legal loopholes and pitfalls.
Property can be challenging. It's a chat. It could be challenging. It could be a minefield. I guess that's part of the fun, I guess, of doing it. Stuart, just looking at my notes briefly. Apologies, people watching the YouTube video here, because I'm now looking at my notes. I mean, covered thermal imaging, how it's beneficial, what it does. You talked about the DREAM app, the Hero app, the possibility of a Hero Plus app, what IRT do. Looking at everything I've got in my notes, I mean, to me, that's everything covered. It makes a lot of sense. We know kind of where we are at the moment. We know what's going on further on down the line, becoming more eco-aware in ways that people can improve their own homes or their portfolios and their properties. How they can do it, the fact that funding is going to be, I imagine, going to be available for quite a long time. We might not always know about it, but funding is there most of the time. I have nothing else on my notes that I think I can add to the listeners. Is there anything that we haven't covered that you feel is important that we need to cover?
Not really, Robert. I would just ask your listeners to just please do something. They don't need to, buy software. They don't need to become a full-on Greta Thunberg here. They just need to do something, do anything. Even if it's boiling less water in the kettle when they need a cup of tea, boil enough for how many cups of tea you're having, have a shorter shower. Anything, everything helps. Literally every little helps. And don't, we've had some clients where we've surveyed their house and we've helped them get grant funding and things, and they've then said, well, I don't bother switching the TV off now because now my energy's free. And you think, man, you're missing the whole point of this thing, is trying to save the planet. You really need to get that macro perspective of what we're all about. What the whole Paris Accord is, the Kyoto Protocol, all these things are geared toward reducing CO2, saving the planet, and perpetuating the planet for our children. And when we're recording this, Robert, the northeast of America is literally on fire, and half of Europe's submerged. Climate change is very, very real, and we need to save lives. And we still, I know I'm on my soapbox again, but we shouldn't have fuel poverty. In 2021, it's ridiculous that people are worrying about switching on a heater. And that is the world we live in. And that's what I'd like on my tombstone, Robert. He was great dad, great husband, made a difference. And that made a difference bit is getting people out of fuel poverty for me. That's what I'd like to do. But on that,
good, and it's always good to have. It's always good to have a drive and a vision and things like that. I think that's imperative. What I would say, Stuart, on that note, is if people want to get hold of you, find out more about IRT surveys and the DREAM software and the Hero app, how do people get in contact with you?
Yeah, best place is the website. The website's just irtsurveys.co.uk. And if you want to get in touch with me personally, you can find me on LinkedIn. That's the easiest way to get in touch with me. And just send me a wee note on there. Or thanks, Robert.
Hey, great. As usual, we will put the links into the show notes for podcast listeners. If you're watching this on YouTube, just look at the description below in order to get in touch with Stuart. Stuart, I'd say a massive thank you for your time. I think that's incredibly insightful. There's a lot that I think we could all be doing, whether we believe we can do it or not. It's something that we can all be doing. So I would urge people to get in touch with yourself, check out everything that's going on, basically. Just become a little bit more socio-aware is probably the way that I would describe that. But Stewart, thank you very much for your time today.
You're very welcome. Thanks for the invitation, Robert. Appreciate it.